History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
And maybe some laughs along the way.
This is History's B-Side. Today's B-Sider is the first African American to play Major League Baseball.
Sports!
Sports, my favorite.
I knew I had to pick a topic that you would enjoy.
You picked well.
I think our listeners will soon find out that between the two of us, you are not the sports fan.
Oh, I'm a vehement fan of all sports as long as I can drink a beer and eat food during them and not pay all that close attention.
See, that's why baseball is the best sport, because you can go to the games and it's more of a social event and you can just have a beer, hang out with your friends, relax, enjoy the sun, and the game's happening around you. Basketball and football, you can go get a beer and you missed half the game.
That's true. I mean, that's very true. Although I can't really speak from experience because largely my experience is just kind of like looking up periodically at the scoreboard and being like, oh, the score changed.
Well, I have been impressed, especially since you did your couple years living in Portland, that you got into being a Blazers fan. And now that
I tried,
you're still have a bit of Steelers fan, and that you're probably more of a sports fan now than I've ever known you to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've started, I don't know, as I got older to just appreciate the, simple escape it provides, I guess. I don't
mental
know if
break
this is the right
from reality.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, it's just fun. At the end of the day, I will never be the kind of person that, like, I will never be the fantasy guy. Like, my cousin watches every NFL game, like, all season. I won't ever watch a game just sitting in my apartment alone. I think what I enjoy about it was kind of being out at, pre-pandemic bars and things like that, watching the game. One of the reasons I started paying attention to the Blazers was the year they kind of went for a streak in the playoffs. We were watching the game. My boss and I were kind of watching the game on our phones as we cleaned up the bar at the wine bar I worked at, and kind of like sprinted 3 blocks to a hotel to watch the end of the game. And it was the one where he throws that like ridiculous 3-pointer from way out and scores. So it was just cool. Like, I don't know. I would always be into it as like a social event, but I don't know that I would ever be the person to follow on my own.
Well, I would bet that even as someone who doesn't necessarily follow sports that closely, if someone were to ask you who the player was, the first black player in Major League Baseball, you'd be able to answer that.
Jackie Robinson, number 42.
See, you even know his number.
Isn't it retired?
Yeah, so we'll talk about it a little bit. I mean, Jackie Robinson is one of the most celebrated players in Major League Baseball history for what he represents. He's recognized for having broken the color barrier in Major League Baseball. And, at the time when he was playing, he did face a lot of harsh criticism and antics, and just words cannot describe what he went through to accomplish what he did.
Did you see the movie, the Chadwick Boseman film?
Yeah, and I saw it when it first came out, and it was really cool because you've met my godson. He's this little black kid, and he has his twin sisters that are, his sisters are twins, they're a year older than him. And when this movie came out, we took him and his sisters to go see the movie, and it was really cool just to see like him watching the movie and like, just kind of recognizing, and he was young, but like being able to recognize how the story of Jackie Robinson was told, like what he went through.
Yeah.
Being different in this white society that was baseball at the time that Jackie Robinson played. So even as a young kid of color, to recognize that and to understand that is something that I've never experienced as a white person. I can't really speak to it, but like it was
Right.
really powerful to. It was a great movie. I very much enjoyed it and learning more about Jackie Robinson through watching the movie. But to experience that with him was pretty cool too.
Yeah. That beats my experience watching it. It was a good movie, though.
Yeah, Jackie Robinson, widely celebrated as having broken the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947. While we're going to talk about in this episode, he was actually not the first black player in Major League Baseball, but he is celebrated for having broken that color barrier, and he did it successfully. Jackie Robinson had a 10-year Major League Baseball career. His first year in the league, he won Rookie of the Year award. 2 years later, he was the National League MVP and the first black player to win that award. 6-time All-Star, he even won the 1955 World Series, and then was later inducted into the Hall of Fame. And as you mentioned, his famous number 42 was later, much later, 50 years after he first played for the Dodgers. His jersey number was retired across all of Major League Baseball, not just the Dodgers, which means that every team in baseball now, no player wears number 42. They let players continue to wear it if they were already wearing 42 at the time it was retired, but once those players left the league, no other player beyond them would wear his number. Except for on April 15th. Every year on April 15th, every player in Major League Baseball wears number 42 just to kind of pay homage to Jackie Robinson on the day that he made his debut for the Dodgers.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, there's a famous line from the movie, actually, that you mentioned, where one of his teammates comes up to him after all the fans in the stands are yelling at him and calling him racial slurs and things like that, where the teammate tries to come comfort him and tell him, hey, we're just here to play baseball, but he puts his arm around him and says, maybe tomorrow we'll all wear number 42, and that way they can't tell which one you are. Obviously a joke because he looks different than the rest of them, but it was just supposed to symbolize the team mentality and sticking up for his brother on the team.
Yeah.
You know, there's a sort of a Youngstown tie-in, so we're both from the Youngstown area, and there's sort of a Youngstown tie-in to the Jackie Robinson story that, since we're talking about this, I just had to bring it home a little bit for us.
For such a small city, there's a lot of Youngstown tie-ins everywhere.
Especially in sports.
I see like random, yeah.
And I mean, normally it's college football and things like that, but not too many baseball stories, but this is one for sure. When Jackie Robinson was first become a member of the Dodgers organization before he made his debut for the actual Dodgers, he played for one of their minor league teams in Toronto, and he had a teammate whose name was George Shotgun Shuba, and George is a native of Youngstown, and in his debut...
Why did he have that name?
I don't know that much about George Shuba. Played long before I was alive. But all the players, older baseball players, especially pre-modern era, had all these really cool nicknames that you could dive into if you're ever bored and looking for something cool.
It's like the mob.
In Jackie Robinson's debut for this minor league team, he hit a home run, and George Shuba was the next batter. So he was walking up to the plate as Jackie's rounding the bases, and he congratulates him when he crosses the plate and shakes his hand. And that's known as the first interracial handshake in a professional baseball game, was when Jackie Robinson crossed the plate in his minor league debut and shook hands with George Shuba.
He was on the team with Jackie, or was he on the opposing team?
He was on the same team. He was batting after Jackie hit the home run, so he was coming up to bat as Jackie was rounding the bases and congratulated him when he crossed the plate.
See, if I was paying attention and really knew how baseball worked, I wouldn't have asked that question.
Well, you're going to learn today.
I hope.
So our hometown of Youngstown, Ohio is actually celebrating the 75th anniversary of this handshake, which will take place later this year. In April of 2021, Youngstown's set to unveil a statue of Jackie Robinson and George Shuba shaking hands at the plate, the first interracial handshake in a professional baseball game.
Do you know where it is, where it's going to be? Not that most people listening will know the ins and outs of Youngstown, but...
I believe it's supposed to be right downtown. I'm not sure the exact location, but in downtown Youngstown. So for anyone who's looking for a great vacation destination, come see sunny Youngstown, Ohio, and our future statue.
That's a whole itinerary right there, baby.
So when we were thinking about episode topics for this podcast, I knew I had to work in a baseball episode pretty early on. And my initial thought for the topic was to focus on another player named Larry Doby. I don't know if you're familiar with Larry Doby, but he was actually the second
I am
player
not.
to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball. But he was the first African American player to play in the American League. Jackie Robinson with the Dodgers was in the National League, and Larry Doby joined the American League 3 months after Jackie Robinson initially broke the color barrier, and he played for a team called the Cleveland Indians.
Oh, snap.
At the time that some people may be listening to their podcast, there might not be a Cleveland Indians, but there will still be a Cleveland baseball team. Name pending.
Have they decided on a name yet? They haven't?
No, they're keeping the name for another year, and then they're going to rebrand as something totally new. We don't know what that will be yet.
So it's not going to be the Spiders.
We don't know. Could be. Larry Doby is often forgotten just because of, Jackie Robinson was the first one to really break into Major League Baseball, and while Doby had a very successful career himself, it wasn't quite as dominant as Jackie Robinson's was. So, he's kind of the forgotten guy who also went through the same struggles and the same racial tensions and everything that Jackie faced. But Larry Doby and his teammate Satchel Paige, who is widely regarded as one of the best pitchers of all time, they were actually the first black teammates to win a World Series for the Cleveland Indians in 1948. As a Cleveland baseball fan myself, it's sad to report that that's the last time Cleveland won a World Series.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
What is
It's been
with
quite
Cleveland?
a while. Yeah. Came so close in 2016 and a couple times in the 90s, but
Oh, man.
still have not done it since Larry Doby and Satchel Paige. Larry Doby also became the second black manager in Major League Baseball when he was managing the White Sox. The first black manager in Major League Baseball managed the Cleveland Indians in 1975. That was Frank Robinson.
Cleveland Indians.
Right?
The Indians are just knocking them
with
back.
The most racist team name and logo were actually the least racist when it came to allowing. Maybe not. That's probably not historically accurate, but they did, break two major color barriers with bringing Larry Doby up as the first African American in the American League, and then the first African American manager in Frank Robinson. Now, a lot of these players, a lot of the more well-known black players, especially early on that came up in the late 40s, early 50s, before they joined Major League Baseball, they had their own careers in what was known as the Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues was not considered major league. It wasn't top tier, but it was still pretty well, it was well known and the players are very talented. A lot of people would argue that the Negro Leagues were on par, if not the same level of talent, but very close in talent to what Major League Baseball was at the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Obviously they were barred from playing in Major League Baseball in the top tier just simply on the color of their skin. But a lot of these players were very talented, and some of them went on to successful careers in Major League Baseball after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier and they left the Negro Leagues. And really the Negro Leagues sort of diminished and kind of fell apart after that point. Once Jackie Robinson and some other players began playing in Major League Baseball, the Negro League sort of ceased to exist. They went on for a couple years after, still sort of playing the same kind of schedule, or they eventually turned into barnstorming teams, which, if you're not familiar with baseball history, barnstorming teams were really kind of, you saw this all throughout the up and coming of baseball as a sport, but barnstorming teams would literally just travel across the country, almost like a circus, and play whatever local team they happen to be in the town of. Sort of similar to the Harlem Globetrotters when they first came to prominence in basketball. They would travel from town to town playing the local college team or whoever would allow them to play just to put on a spectacle. They were a lot more talented than people gave them credit for, and they'd kind of beat up on the local team. So barnstorming teams were pretty well known, and a lot of Major League Baseball players would do that in the off season. But once the Negro League sort of ceased to exist as an organized league, some of the teams turned into those barnstorming teams.
Interesting.
What's also interesting to note about the Negro Leagues is they had 3 well-known female players, which is not something that we've seen in Major League Baseball.
Huh.
The first one to enter into the Negro Leagues, her name was Toni Stone. She was a second baseman for the Indianapolis Clowns. She joined the team in 1953.
I love baseball names. It's so good.
She joined the team, or she was signed to the team to replace Hank Aaron, who had just left the team. And Hank Aaron is some people would consider him the home run king of Major League Baseball. He finished with 755 career home runs, and was only passed by Barry Bonds in the very early 2000s. And a lot of people don't recognize Barry Bonds as having passed that milestone because of his aid in using performance-enhancing drugs, steroids. Kind of came up during that era. So a lot of people still do recognize Hank Aaron as being, the home run king. Later joining Tony Stone on the Indianapolis Clowns was Connie Morgan. She actually came to replace Tony Stone when Tony moved on to the Kansas City Monarchs, one of the more well-known Negro League teams. And
so
probably
were these women all black?
yes,
Is that to be assumed? Okay.
Negro Leagues were all black players. Some of the owners were black as well, which was pretty novel at the time. There were a few white owners, obviously having money and financing the league. But, the Negro Leagues were kind of embraced as part of black culture at the time and really going out on their own and doing their own thing because they were barred from the major leagues.
Yeah.
The last of the three women is probably the most well-known of the three. Her name was Mammy Peanut Johnson. She was a pitcher for the Indianapolis Clowns. All three women played for the same team initially, and they were really played during that barnstorming era. But she got the nickname Peanut. She was obviously a small stature, but she was in the middle of a game where she was pitching against Hank Bayless of the Kansas City Monarchs. And after she threw a hard strike at him, he stepped out of the batter's box and said, "Why, that little girl's no bigger than a peanut. I ain't afraid of her." Then she proceeded to strike him out. How
Nice.
awesome is that?
That's fantastic. Go Peanut.
Yeah. So the Negro Leagues, they pretty much ceased to exist at that point. They were, like I said, they moved on to kind of a barnstorming teams. They weren't really as organized once Major League Baseball started accepting black players, and a lot of the talent left the Negro Leagues themselves. Very recently, at the end of 2020, Major League Baseball made the decision to retroactively elevate the Negro Leagues to Major League status. Major League just means the top tier of baseball, which means that all of those players' stats and records are counted alongside the existing Major League Baseball stats and records that we look back on and reflect on today as some of the best players. Another notable player from the Negro Leagues was named Josh Gibson, who a lot of people are now considering to be the home run king because based on some of his unofficial box scores and stats, it's claimed that he hit nearly 900 home runs during his Negro League career.
Those unofficial box scores would be from his time in the Negro Leagues?
Yeah, and that's what makes it confusing. They played a lot of exhibition games against teams that weren't in the Negro Leagues, or some of these barnstorming games, or spring training, off-season, games that didn't necessarily count towards their regular season. So while it's believed that he hit nearly 900 home runs during the course of his career, probably only 238 of them were actually in official games that counted. So it's unlikely that he's going to be seen as, unseating Barry Bonds, Hank Aaron, Babe Ruth as some of the top home run hitters of all time.
Sure.
But there were players who had good careers in both leagues, like Larry Doby, Jackie Robinson, Satchel Paige. Some of those players should actually get a boost to some of their career numbers, career statistics, just because of their involvement in the Negro Leagues before they joined Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
It's still pretty unclear. Like I said, this is a new elevation for the Negro Leagues to become considered Major League status. So it's not really sure how all this is going to affect their records and their history, but you could argue that those three female players could be considered the first three women to play Major League Baseball if they include those years in what they classify as Major League.
Have there been other female players in the league since, or are there currently?
No, not really. They're just starting to sort of bring more women into the sport, which is good. It's good to have that, recognition and just involvement for people to see that it's not just an all-male thing. It's not a boys' club. You can have women involved in the sport. The San Francisco Giants hired their first female coach at the beginning of last season.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she was maybe the first base coach or something like that. And recently, I think just within the last week or so, the Boston Red Sox hired their first black female coach, who's going to be some kind of hitting instructor in their minor league system, which is awesome. And it's not like they're just doing this to get a woman in the system to say that they hired a woman. These are qualified women. A lot of them have had not only their own playing careers, whether it was little league through college softball, and even there's levels of professional softball, but These women have been involved in coaching in college programs and other systems and other organized baseball, or they're very involved in the
Yeah.
analytics side that baseball is really turning to. They have a lot of the technical knowledge that, some of the old school ball players, the guys that had long careers and just naturally become coaches because that's what you do. They don't understand
For
some of these
sure.
things, and the way baseball is shifting to really develop players through analytics and through player development, these are the kinds of coaches that they're looking for now, and it's great to see more women represented in the sport.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So as far as players, do you know of any others?
Not in major leagues. You do see a little bit. It's always a good storyline when there's a female player in the Little League World Series. There was a real well-known one a
Yeah.
couple years ago, Monet Davis, who was a black girl that pitched in the the Little League World Series, and she was very good. She was probably the best pitcher in Little League that year, and she went on to have a pretty successful college softball career. And there's professional softball, there's college softball. That's all very competitive, and they're good athletes. But there haven't been any female players that have been in any level of Major League Baseball aside from the couple that we know from the Negro Leagues.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's a little bit of background on some of the more well-known African American players, at least from the ones who played in the Negro Leagues and then made that transition into modern-day Major Leagues. Obviously, we have quite a few players in Major League Baseball now that are Black, African American, some with very successful careers, but it really took these people like Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby to, suffer through what they had to in breaking through that color barrier to really set the table for these future players to come.
Yeah.
Why don't we take a short break and then we'll get a little bit into who was actually the first African American to play in Major League Baseball.
We'll be right back.
We just want to take a minute and thank you for listening to History's B-Side. It takes a lot of time to research and put these episodes together, so we wanted to let you know how you can support the show going forward.
Go ahead and subscribe at anchor.fm/History's B-Side or wherever you're listening from. If you'd like, leave us a review and tell us what you think of our show.
If you're interested in advertising with the show and hearing your message in a spot like this, send us an email to historiesbside@gmail.com.
We're looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.
So today we're telling the story of the first African American to play in Major League Baseball. And I think to understand what that means and how you get that consideration, you have to first understand what Major League Baseball is. Now, we talk about professional sports a lot, especially today, but Major League Baseball hasn't always been the organization that it is now. When you think of the National Football League, it's a very specific organization, NBA the same way, but Major League Baseball typically just refers to being the top tier of organized baseball. More so than even just, this big enterprise that is $1 billion whatever, but Major League Baseball is just a designation that means these are the best of the best.
So there's like an entire slew of other levels that kind of go down the ranks?
Yeah, and there's a lot of different designations of professional baseball players. In addition to Major League Baseball, there is a whole class of minor leagues. And minor leagues could be anything from what's called affiliated, which are all these teams that, the players that play for an affiliated minor league team are going to play in Major League Baseball someday, or that's what they aspire to because they're connected to these major league organizations. Teams like the New York Yankees will have 4 or 5 or 6 teams below them whose players will one day play for the Yankees.
Wow. So they're just kind of like, this is a terrible phrase to use, but like farming their own players.
Well, yeah, it's often called a farm system, these younger teams. Yeah, as soon as they get drafted or signed from wherever, they'll play for these lower level teams to kind of develop their skills and work their way up. And the better they perform, they'll move up to the higher tiers until they eventually play for the major league club. A lot of players fizzle out and don't actually make it that far, but that's how the teams really, shop through their system to figure out who's going to be the top tier.
So is it more uncommon then for, like college athletes to get directly drafted like they sometimes do in the NBA or NFL? Or does that still happen to a fair degree?
So a lot of these minor league players come from either seniors in high school or college players, at least the
Okay.
ones that come from America. And then these clubs still have international offices in, a lot of Latin American countries and some overseas, scouts in Asia, some of these Japan leagues, things like that. It's pretty rare that you would see a player get drafted and then immediately play for the major league club. They'll
Okay.
usually spend at least 1, if not 2, 3, 4 years in the minor league system before they move up to the major league team.
Gotcha. Okay.
And there are other levels of minor leagues that are professional, paid players that, they're just not necessarily affiliated with a major league baseball club. A lot of these are called independent leagues, but the players get paid to play for the team. They're just not necessarily on a course where they will one day end up in Major League Baseball. There's also
Gotcha.
not so much anymore, but especially when baseball was first developing, there were a lot of semi-professional teams, which means some of the players were paid to be there. Other ones were more amateur status. They just played for the team because it was something to do. And then collegiate teams are sort of along the same lines where college players can't be paid. So they're on the team while they're in school, hoping to one day aspire to get drafted or signed to a major league or professional team. But they're still the younger players who
Sure.
aren't being paid. They're just kind of doing it because they see a future in the sport or because they just love playing baseball.
Gotcha.
And especially when baseball was first, coming up and establishing itself back in the 1800s, there was a lot of people who played baseball and maybe played professionally, but they wouldn't have the type of career that you would imagine today. It'd be guys that played for a team for maybe just one game, maybe for 40 games, maybe for a year, and they were considered Major League Baseball players, but they weren't necessarily had the long careers that you see today. Like we talked about, Jackie Robinson played 10 years for the Dodgers. That was
Yeah.
very uncommon when baseball was first establishing itself.
Interesting.
When we talk about the history of baseball, you'll often hear it referred to as the modern era, which is not as modern as you might think. The modern era actually began in 1903. And that's really when we established what we know today between the American League and the National League, when they first sort of combined to form today's Major League Baseball. These leagues established independent of themselves. So the National League first was established in 1876, and the American League didn't really form until 1901. The reason we call it the modern era is because when these two leagues first started playing each other, only happened in the World Series, and the first World Series happened in 1903. You take the
Okay.
best team in the National League would play the best team in the American League.
Interesting. So, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head when football and basketball began. Does baseball predate them?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some older versions of every sport. Like, I think NFL just claimed that they celebrated their 100th season a year or two ago, but their 100th season doesn't necessarily line up with there being, 54 Super Bowls or whatever we're on now, because some of the
Sure.
early iterations of the National Football League really weren't the National Football League as we know now. In sort of the same
Right.
sense, there's been Major League Baseball a lot longer than 1903. It's just when we think of Major League Baseball today, we think of it as an organization, but really it just refers to the fact that there are two top-tier leagues, the American League and the National League. And they were always viewed as separate. The two leagues themselves never actually played each other in the regular season until 1997. Really only 23, 24 years ago that these two leagues really started to intermix with each other. Teams would play for the American League or the National League. They wouldn't play against each other. They wouldn't really even be traded between the American League and the National League. They would stay within their own league.
But they still played the World Series.
Yeah, they would take the best team in the National
Okay.
League to play the best team in the American League. And that's why it was a big deal that Larry Doby broke the color barrier in the American League compared to Jackie Robinson breaking it in the National League.
Gotcha. Okay.
The leagues obviously were established to compete with each other as a business entity. That's why we have multiple leagues, because one thought that they could outsurvive the other one and make more money.
Interesting. Okay. That's what I was about to ask is why all the different leagues. So would you have like some cities that had two teams, one in each league?
Yeah, and you see that today. I mean, New York has the Yankees in the American League, the Mets in the National League. Chicago has a team
Yeah.
in each. So, I mean, that still exists, but especially back in the day when there were a lot of competing professional leagues, they weren't all considered top-tier major league, but there were definitely leagues and teams that competed with each other, and sometimes they would play each other even though they weren't in the same league, they wouldn't be official games. They would be like exhibition games, that type of thing.
Okay.
The first semblance of a organized professional league was called the National Association of Baseball Players. It was organized in 1857, survived about 14 years, and it really wasn't professional as we would consider it today. You know, a lot of the players were paid and organized paid players, but not fully. A lot of the players were still amateur, and it'd be kind of a mix of professional and semi-pro. But this was really the first semblance of organized professional baseball.
So that long ago, was the game significantly different, or has it remained largely the same this entire time?
For the most part, it's the same. There were definitely some rule differences, and sometimes rule differences between the leagues. You know, when baseball was first established, things like a foul ball weren't considered a strike, or there'd be a different number of balls that would lead to a walk. Equipment requirements, even sometimes team structures were a little bit different. But for the most part, the game has been pretty much the same. You know, you get 3 outs, you can try to get a guy around the bases and score a run. You can find, if you search for it, old lists of the original rules to baseball, and a lot of them are still pretty similar to what they are today. Now, this first league, the National Association of Baseball Players, it actually established in its, league rules committee, they voted to bar any club, quote, composed of one or more colored persons, which was in effect the first documented color line in baseball to exclude African Americans from participating in that league's games. It's really the first time that we start to see this color barrier established in baseball.
So that's just after the Civil War?
Yeah, it would be right about the same time, right when the Civil War ended, that we start to see this color line form in baseball. So this first association turned into a new league in 1871, which was very similarly called the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, but this time it was the first fully professional league. And a lot of these new teams that were formed later rolled into what we now know as the new National League.
Okay.
This league existed for about 5 years, 1871 to 75, and then was reestablished as the more formally and still exists today, the National League.
Gotcha. Okay.
Some other major leagues that had major league designation at the time was the Union Association. Only existed for 1 year in 1884. Like I said, a lot of these leagues were established because of a wealthy guy saw it as a business opportunity, as a way to, make some money by funding this league and getting teams to join it. But if they weren't financially stable enough, the leagues wouldn't survive beyond even a year or a couple years.
Okay.
Later on in 1882, a league called the American Association was established. They were established to compete with the National League, and they actually, between the two leagues, had their own version of a World Series. Wasn't called that at the time, but the American Association's winner would compete against the National League's winner in this early version of the World Series. And then when the American Association eventually folded in 1891, a lot of these teams either joined the National League or they took on minor league status. So the teams would still exist, they just wouldn't be competing at this professional level, and they'd have to find other leagues to join.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's this American Association that we're going to talk about today with today's topic. Some of the notable teams from that league still exist in today's Major League Baseball. Teams like the Cincinnati Red Stockings, now known as the Cincinnati Reds, the Pittsburgh Alleghenies, who later became the Pittsburgh Pirates, the St. Louis Browns, who changed names a couple times before turning into the modern St. Louis Cardinals, and another one, the Brooklyn Atlantics, who later turned into the Brooklyn Grays, the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers, and are today known as the Los Angeles Dodgers, most recent World Series champion.
Bridegrooms.
Crazy
I want to know
baseball names.
Yeah, right.
Speaking of weird names, one final team that's worth noting in the American Association was the Cleveland Spiders, as you mentioned, rumored to be the new name of the Cleveland Indians. This is not the same team that exists in Cleveland today. The Cleveland Spiders, they were one of the teams that later joined the National League, but then their owner also owned the St. Louis Browns. And while they actually had some success in the National League, the Cleveland Spiders had success in the National League, the owner started intentionally trading all of the good players from the Cleveland Spiders to the St. Louis Browns.
Oh, that's Rude.
and just ran the Spiders into the ground. They set the still record for the worst record in professional baseball with, I don't even know, it was over 100 losses.
People, man.
Just absolutely terrible. Teams wouldn't even play in Cleveland. They had to play most of their games on the road, and the team eventually folded. So
People are always doing Cleveland dirty like that.
the Cleveland team that exists now is not the same as the Cleveland Spiders, but who knows? Maybe they'll carry that nickname pretty soon. So the man we're here to talk about today, his name is, finally we're getting into the topic of the show.
The topic.
His name is
Phil likes baseball.
Moses Fleetwood Walker. He's credited with being the first African American to play in the major leagues. Now Moses, or Fleet as he was known, was born in 1856 and grew up in Mount Pleasant, Ohio, near Steubenville.
Whoop, whoop. Ohio's representing this whole episode.
Right? Who would have thought? His father was actually one of the first black physicians in Ohio. Thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But Fleet and his brother Weldy attended Steubenville High School. They were enrolled shortly after the community passed legislation for racial integration. So they were pretty well integrated throughout most of their life. He was used to being around white people and playing in baseball leagues and baseball teams with other white players.
Yeah.
He played catcher for Oberlin College and started to gain local stardom from his ability to hit long home runs. His little brother Weldy and one of his white teammates, Harlan Burkett, they led Oberlin's first intercollegiate team in 1881, and they won the season finale 9-2 over the University of Michigan. Following the game, with his performance in that game, he was recruited to join the University of Michigan's baseball team. He went there to study law, played baseball as their leadoff hitter and their catcher, and the team went 10-3, where he hit 308. For non-baseball people, 308 means that you're getting a hit basically 30% of the time that you come to bat. That's pretty good.
Okay.
I would say an average batting average is probably around 250, so 25% of the time. 308 is pretty good.
So it's essentially a percentage of success.
It's how many times you come up to bat are you going to get a hit.
Gotcha. Okay.
During the summers of his college years, Fleet would play on some of these semi-professional teams. In 1881, this was the season right before he joined the University of Michigan, he was paid by the White Sewing Machine Company of Cleveland to play for their semi-pro team. And it was with this team that he encountered his real first racial issues while playing baseball. They were scheduled to face the Louisville Eclipse in Kentucky. It was an away game. And upon arrival, the team hotel wouldn't even let him stay there with the team. And when they went to play their game the next day, the opponents refused to play the game with him in the lineup. So they had to play someone else at catcher, a white player at catcher, who soon complained that his hands were too sore to keep playing in the game. This was obviously late 1800s. They didn't have the equipment that we have today. So the catchers actually didn't wear really any protective gear, a sort of maybe sometimes a mask or maybe some padded lambskin covering on their hands. No gloves.
That's wild. So did pitchers pitch as fast back then?
No, not anything like we see today. I mean, you still had some people who really did throw hard, probably in the 80s at least, but nothing like you see today where you have pitchers touching 98, 99 miles an hour pretty frequently.
Yeah.
But that's still pretty hard. I mean, you try catching basically a rock at 80 miles an hour with your bare hands. Because it was believed that Fleet Walker himself preferred to catch without gloves, but obviously that led to some sore hands and some injuries, so the catchers weren't playing every day. Now, when his backup said that he was too sore to keep playing in the game from obviously catching without proper equipment, the team tried to put Walker into the game, but the other team refused to continue if he came in the game. They refused to play against a black man. So the team had to take Walker out, and once someone else, I believe it was the third baseman on the team, agreed to go play catcher just so that the game could continue.
It it definitely reminds you a lot of, at least what I know of Jackie Robinson's experience. I mean, the most recent thing I can call back is some of the things they portrayed in the movie, but it's kind of wild that from this time all the way through the 1940s, things didn't really change all that much.
Yeah, and it's crazy because we are talking about 60 years apart, and it's almost like not only did the racial tensions and the abuse that Jackie Robinson went through wasn't anything different from 60 years earlier, and some cases it might have even gotten worse after 60 years of just
Yeah.
really bad race relations. And just now we're talking about we're talking about the first African American to play professional baseball, and we're saying that it wasn't Jackie Robinson. That's in no way to take away from what Jackie Robinson went through to break the color barrier. And we'll talk about this more as the episode goes on, but it's, like you said, it's some of the same things that Jackie went through that we know of, and it's the same thing that happened 60 years earlier to different players, and especially to Fleet Walker.
Yeah.
So the year following his time with Cleveland's semi-professional team, he joined another semi-professional team in Newcastle, Pennsylvania called the Neshaniks. This time he was joined by his old Oberlin teammate Harlan Burkett. Now the local press in Newcastle was very positive about Fleet Walker. He was a very good baseball player for this time. They wrote that he was, quote, one of the best catchers in the country, a gentleman in every sense of the word, both on the ball field and off, and he was brilliant behind the bat. What's interesting, though, is that the Newcastle newspaper never mentioned the color of his skin. They wrote about him just like any other white player.
Which is, probably commendable. I don't know. Is it commendable?
Yeah,
I feel like it.
You can see both sides, because on the one hand, it'd be super easy for them to just write about him as the colored guy on their team, or probably phrased in different words than that. But to not mention it sort of puts him on par with the white players too, which based on his play and just who he was, he deserved every bit of being equal and being on par with all the white players. On the other hand, it could just be the easier way out for them to not mention that he was the colored player, because then, I don't know, there's less public judgment in the way that they're writing about him to put him on that par.
Interesting. Well, go Newcastle, either way.
So the following year, in 1883, Fleet received his first professional contract to play for the Toledo Blue Stockings, which at the time was a minor league team in the Northwestern League. Even before his first season began, a motion was passed by the league's executive committee to bar colored players from joining the league. But that proposal was quickly dismissed simply for Walker, because they said, quote, besides being a good player, he is intelligent and has many friends.
Jesus. Oh, Lord.
How low is the bar set there?
It's just one more of those like kind of dehumanizing phrases that I don't know.
Yeah, you wouldn't say that about a white player that, well, we'll let him play because people seem to like him.
He reads well. He reads well and dresses nice.
He went on that year to play in 60 of Toledo's 84 games, and the team actually won the pennant. And he made significant contributions to the team, both as a hitter and behind the plate. The local newspaper, the Toledo Daily Blade, wrote, quote, Walker has played more games and has been of greater value behind the bat than any catcher in the league.
So he's a killer ball player.
Yeah, he was really good for his time, and you'll see that's why, he's a big part of why this team later joins, and we'll talk about it later, joins the major league level. But he was every bit deserving to be on this team, and he was a big part of them and why they had success.
Yeah.
Earlier in the same season, the Chicago White Stockings, who were led by Cap Anson, came to Toledo for an exhibition game. The Chicago White Stockings were a member of the National League, so they were Major League. So them to play a minor league team made this not an official game, but like I said, teams would often do this. Chicago White Stockings still exist today. They are known as the Chicago Cubs.
Oh.
Later
I was
changed
waiting
names,
for White Sox.
and when the modern Chicago White Sox joined the American League, they took on sort of a modern version of this old team name from the other franchise in the city. Like I said, the Chicago White Sox were led by Cap Anson, who is, historically known as one of the best ball players of the time. He's a Hall of Famer. He was a player manager for the Chicago White Stockings and one of the more prominent players of that era. He was also a notorious, well-known racial bigot and played a large part in the end of the African American participation in organized baseball.
Great. So, I mean, he basically went after Walker
Yeah.
and his status in the league. Okay. Was Walker the only black man playing for the league, or were there others at the time?
As far as I know, he was the only black player in this league.
Okay. So this is kind of what set up the barrier to be reinstated for Jackie Robinson to later re-break, essentially.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a lot more as this goes on. You know,
Okay.
obviously, Fleet becomes this first professional or first major league player, but it really also doesn't set the table well for future African Americans to play in Major League Baseball. And this first incident plays a big role in that. The Chicago White Stockings come to town for this exhibition game, and you know, Cap Anson isn't really thrilled with the fact that they have a black player on their team. And the local newspaper, the Toledo Daily Blade, describes the incident pretty well. They say, quote, Walker, the colored catcher of the Toledo club, was a source of contention between the home club and the Chicago club. Shortly after their arrival in the city, the Toledo club was informed that there was an objection in the Chicago club to Toledo's playing Walker, the colored catcher. Walker had a very sore hand, and it had not been intended to play him in yesterday's game, and this was stated to the bearer of the announcement for the Chicagos. Not content with this, the visitors declared with the swagger for which they are noted that they would play ball with no damned N-word. The order was given, then and there, to play Walker, and the beefy bluffer was informed that he could play or go. The beefy bluffer being Cap Anson.
Beefy bluffer.
Anson hauled in his horns somewhat and consented to play, remarking, "We'll play this game here, but won't never play no more with the N-word in." And obviously, I cleaned that up for podcasting.
So he's a real well-spoken gentleman.
Yeah, he was not the friendliest of guys. And really, the only reason he relented to play that game was because Chicago would have forfeited their share of the ticket sales. They played these exhibition games for money, not for any actual standing or purpose for their season. But he wasn't going to travel to Toledo and not make any money off of it, so he relented to the game. This incident, like we talked about, put the issue of having black players in organized baseball to the forefront, and it's really what began a blatant but successful effort to one day bar black players from organized baseball.
So it kind of pushed the buttons with Anson enough that he and others were willing to try so hard to bar black players.
Yeah, it was almost like Anson made it his personal mission to not let black players in the league.
It's great. It's very, very big of him.
And it's probably important to note that Anson was not alone in his thinking at the time. That was the common position for white players then. Not just white players, white fans, white owners. There was a reason that Fleet Walker was unique in being one of the only black players in these leagues. And it wasn't because black players weren't good athletes.
So do you think, was he well received by his own fans, his own team, or did he receive a lot of the same treatment from them as he did from folks like Anson?
Yeah, it was never 100% supportive. Now, the local press and the local fans were probably a lot more supportive than the visiting fans and the visiting press.
Sure.
Because they're used to him and he helps their team and they see him more often. But we'll hear some stories that even his own teammates didn't really like having a black player on their team. They didn't view him on the same level or the same skill level and just human level that they were.
Yeah.
So Toledo's success in the 1883 season, where they won their pennant, propelled the club to join the Major League American Association in 1884. This meant that when Walker made his debut on May 1st, it made him the first African American to play in the major leagues. However, he was still constantly subjected to abuse, verbal and physical threats of violence by both fans and press outside of Toledo, opposing players who refused to take the field against him, and even his own teammates.
Dang.
Prior to a road game in Richmond, Virginia, Toledo's manager received a letter that read, "Dear Sir, we the undersigned do hereby warn you not to put up Walker, the Negro catcher, the evenings that you play in Richmond, as we could mention the names of 75 determined men who have sworn to mob Walker if he comes to the ground in a suit.
Wow.
We hope you will listen to our words of warning, so that there will be no trouble, but if you do not, there will certainly be. We only write this to prevent much bloodshed, as you alone can prevent."
Jesus. I mean,
That's gross.
again, it's super gross. It's kind of sad that this was probably not an uncommon thing. It definitely wasn't an uncommon thing at the time.
And it was almost, let me phrase this the right way. At the time, that was viewed as an acceptable response to this.
Yeah.
We'll continue.
Yeah, I mean, just for going to a game, right? Like,
Here's even a story from one of his own teammates. Tony Mullane, who was a white pitcher for Toledo and one of the hardest throwing pitchers in the league, said, "Walker was the best catcher I ever worked with, but I disliked a Negro, and whenever I had to pitch to him, I used to pitch anything I wanted without looking at his signals. One day he signaled me for a curve, and I shot a fastball at him." So, if you're not familiar with baseball, the catcher will sign to the pitcher what pitch he wants him to throw. Usually, you'll see them put some fingers down if you're watching on TV, like 1 for a fastball or 2 fingers for a curveball, something like that. But what this pitcher would do is, if Walker signed that he wanted him to throw a curveball, the pitcher would throw a fastball, and he's expecting the ball to move in a certain way, and it comes in a lot faster and not moving, can really get a catcher hurt, especially
yeah.
catchers who aren't wearing equipment against a hard-throwing pitcher who, if you don't know what's coming, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
This pitcher just did it. He even noted how well or what a good player Walker was, but he just did it because he didn't like him because he was a Negro.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible the kind of wherewithal guys like Walker and Robinson had when it came to just sticking with this game that they loved and, you know, pushing through for, I mean, I assume they both had a pretty good grasp on what they were doing socially, but
I think that's truly it. Like, Walker had no, I mean, obviously financial incentive to play, because I'm sure he made a better living playing baseball than he would have doing whatever he might have otherwise. But really, how much is worth going through what you go through when your life is at stake every city that you travel to for no
Yeah.
reason other than the color of your skin? He's playing because he loves the game, because he's good at it, and because it's a way for him to provide for himself and his family.
yeah.
Now, he only ended up playing for 42 games for Toledo that year and was released from the team following an injury. He was a catcher back when they didn't have equipment. Injuries were very common.
Sure.
And despite finishing as an above-average hitter, he never returned to major leagues. His brother, Weldy, actually became the second black player in the major leagues when he joined the team for 5 games that same season.
Huh.
Some baseball historians will note that a man named William Edward White may have actually been the first black player in the major leagues, which came 5 years earlier than Fleet Walker. But White was actually a mixed race. He was the son of a white plantation owner and a black slave. And White actually lived his life as a white man. He was raised by the plantation owner as one of his own sons. So he likely faced none of the racial abuse that Walker and his little brother experienced themselves. And he only appeared in 1 game for the National League Brooklyn Grays on June 21st, 1879. Now, while a lot of people don't really consider William Edward White to then be this first black player, that's also interesting to note that he played that 1 game for the National League Brooklyn Grays, who we know later turned into the Brooklyn Dodgers, which is the team that broke the color barrier later with Jackie Robinson. But since White lived his life largely as a white man and didn't face any of this abuse, it does make Fleet at least the first openly black player in Major League Baseball, the first one to really
Yeah.
go through all of this abuse just to play baseball.
For sure.
For the rest of his baseball career, Walker bounced between various semi-professional teams and different leagues with average to little success. He never made it back to the major leagues. In one incident in 1887, he was playing for Newark in the International League. He again was scheduled to face Cap Anson in the Chicago White Stockings in an exhibition game, but on Cap's demands, Fleet and the other black players on the team were not permitted to play. And this really later led to the eventual banning of black players from that same league and other organized baseball.
Oh my God, this Cap Anson dude.
They pushed the league to not accept any more contracts or extend any contracts to colored players.
He's just the worst. He's like, if he was a movie character, he would be the guy with like the Mustang and the gelled hair and the bully jacket, like the Letterman jacket that just like shoved kids in the hallway and booked kids. I can see him.
Yeah, and again,
The worst.
I mean, while Cap Anson may be the foil to Fleet Walker's story, he was not alone in that mindset. There were plenty of other players and owners and people that were running these leagues that were just as much against having black players as he was.
So do you think, in a way, I know I said earlier that not much had changed, and in a big picture kind of way, it really hadn't. But do you think that in some kind of way Walker was a bit, I don't want to say braver, but do you think he had it worse than Jackie Robinson having come earlier? Because, I mean, there had to have been some progress. Not much, but...
Yeah, it's hard to say, and I don't think I am the right person to comment on that. Obviously, as a white
Fair.
person, I've never had to experience any kind of, racial violence or anything like that. I can see why that would be true, coming up in even just 60 years less advanced society, that Walker would face some things that maybe he didn't expect in a way that Jackie Robinson expected coming into Major League Baseball. But, I mean, you hear so many stories about Jackie Robinson, like, I don't know how anyone could go through what he went through and then continue to pursue a career in baseball, literally facing these threats every day. And when you talk about either one of them going through that, that's not to diminish what the other person experienced as well. They both faced threats to their lives just for trying to play baseball for no reason other than the color of their skin. Like, they were both very good players. Obviously, Jackie Robinson went on to a more prominent career, but that's even just the nature of the era that he played in.
Sure. And that, he actually got to play with a glove, probably. Poor Walker's out here with a bare hand, just palming 80-mile-an-hour fastballs.
Following his baseball career, Walker ended up working for the Postal Service. In 1891, he was actually involved in a racial dispute where, while acting on self-defense, he stabbed and killed a white man. But he was acquitted of the charge of second-degree murder. However, the incident, along with some of his disputes with Cap Anson, and that leading to the barring of black players from organized baseball itself, are largely why Walker is forgotten about as having been the first black player in Major League Baseball. He eventually moved to his home in Steubenville, where he owned and operated various hotels and theaters and other entertainment venues with his brother Weldy. He passed away of pneumonia in May of 1924 in Steubenville, and you can still go visit his grave there today. Like you were saying, though, it's hard to compare the careers of Fleet Walker and Jackie Robinson. Obviously, Jackie was in the league much longer. He had a lot more success, and he's always going to be remembered for that. And the fact that Jackie Robinson played in the modern era compared to the pre-modern leagues that were always forming and dissolving that Fleet Walker played in. There's people today who were alive when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier and remember that day, remember watching him. Regardless of what their opinion on the situation then, there's people that experienced it and know what that was like. And also just their own impact on baseball, on the game and the future of the game. That's really why they have different legacies. Fleet Walker was the first and really last black player in Major League Baseball of his era.
For a long time.
Whereas Jackie Robinson paved the way for future black players to
He
take
was
the
the first
field.
of many.
It was only 3 months later that Larry Doby joined the American League, and then we have all these other former Negro League players joining them, and future players that didn't even have to go through that stepping stone of the Negro Leagues, that just were viewed as good enough ball players to be outright drafted or signed to these minor league clubs to eventually work their way up to the major leagues. It's fascinating listening to modern players talk about what Jackie Robinson's legacy means for them as ball players today. Just knowing what he went through so that they can make their own career playing the same sport and not have to go through some of the things that Jackie Robinson went through.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, I know you mentioned earlier, not like you said, not to downplay Jackie Robinson, and I don't think it really necessitates that. I mean, they both punched holes in their own way, in their own eras, and against their own varying sets of pretty intense obstacles. And I don't think to celebrate Walker necessarily has to downplay Robinson. It clearly was never going to take one guy.
Right, and I mean, that's how a lot of our problems are solved today, isn't it? You have some first experiences that, don't go well historically, and they're not remembered in the way that they should be as being the big moment they are. And that's not to justify anything that any of these players went through, but we learn from them, and we, build a better society from growing from these experiences.
For sure.
Well, that was a heavy topic about baseball.
Hey, baseball is, I'm sure you would agree, and I'm going to say this, although it's not really how I feel about the game as a whole, but it's a game of drama and history and extraordinary depth.
If I can get on a soapbox and talk about baseball for just a second, I know we view it as the American pastime, but I do think it is, in a way, a good analogy for our history and even just life in general. And I won't go into an existential sermon about baseball, but the game has changed so much in the 170 years that we've talked about just in this episode, but the game has developed in the same way that America itself has developed, and how we globalize to other cultures. I mean, heck, half the league right now isn't even white players anymore. We have so many Latino players, and obviously black players, and European and Asian players now. The game is growing around the world, and it's the best of the best come here to play in the major leagues. So it's cool to see how the game has changed, and it's good to get away from players that had the mindset of Cap Anson to players that are just in the league because they're good at what they do and they have a lot of friends.
Yeah. You ready for your quiz?
I hope so.
All right, we'll be right back. We like to end each episode with a short quiz to see how much we've learned and to test you as the listener to see what you've held on to and found interesting. So I've got 3 questions here for Phil, 2 pertaining to the MLB, Major League, professional baseball, and 1 just kind of having to do with pop culture and baseball in general.
I'm the worst at pop culture.
Well, I added them together. You actually mentioned this at some point today, I think. So you might be all right on it.
Hopefully I get the baseball ones at least.
So we'll start with the non-baseball so that you can just focus. What is the name of the fictitious minor league baseball team on The Simpsons TV show? This is multiple choice.
I already
unless
know it.
you just want to swing.
It's the Springfield Isotopes.
It sure is. Good job. See, I knew you'd know it.
Until they moved the team to Albuquerque. And actually, there's a minor league baseball team that's called the Albuquerque Isotopes. And I don't know what they were originally, but after that Simpsons episode aired, they rebranded as the Albuquerque Isotopes. And that was like, they sold more merchandise within the first 2 weeks of rebranding than they did.
Oh my God.
The entire time they existed before that.
That's hysterical.
Probably helps that I was watching The Simpsons like not that long ago and decided to look that up.
I've actually never seen a full his Simpsons episode.
What the heck is wrong with you?
I just never watched it.
This is also back-to-back episodes that we've mentioned The Simpsons on our podcast. I'm counting
I
our
thought
pop
we had
culture
just talked about
references.
it.
We've got 2 about Bruce Almighty, 2 about The Simpsons now.
We should have a like contest to see who can reference the most thing. Although you said you weren't a moviegoer.
We need a dedicated listener to track this for us.
So for your second question, we'll go back to the pure MLB questions. So name the only player. It's the only player to hit both a major league home run and score an NFL touchdown in the same week.
That's got to be... Oh. I mean, it's got to be either Bo Jackson or Deion Sanders.
Got to pick one.
I'm thinking it's Bo Jackson.
It is Deion Sanders, but I'll still give it to you.
You know what?
Knowing
So
between
that's
the two
another
of
thing,
them,
and I'm just going to tell another story to flex my baseball knowledge. Deion Sanders played in a World Series game on... Let me see if I can remember this right. He played in a World Series game on Saturday night, then flew to play in an NFL game on a Sunday afternoon, and then flew again to play in a World Series game on Sunday night. All in,
Jesus.
yeah, within a span of 24 hours, basically. But he was like, he got to the Sunday night baseball game right as it was starting or something, and the manager wouldn't let him play because he was late to the game.
Oh,
so
no.
he almost played in all 3 games within like a 24-hour span, but he didn't technically play in the second baseball game.
Dang. That's wild. How does his body do that?
Good athlete.
And so for your third and final one, we talked a bit about, some pitchers and pitching speeds today. Who was the first major league player to pitch a ball over 100 miles per hour?
Was it Bob Feller?
It was not.
Oh. Walter Johnson.
On September... Also not Walter Johnson.
Who was it?
Nolan Ryan.
Okay, so I was going to say Nolan Ryan, but there is debate as to whether or not Bob Feller could throw over 100 miles an hour. They just didn't have sophisticated equipment back then. There's a video you can look up of him measuring his fastball against someone riding a motorcycle to try to prove how fast he threw the ball.
That's wild. I knew asking trivia questions about baseball was a bad idea.
But Nolan Ryan, I believe, is recorded as the fastest fastball of all time. Although there are some players today that really challenge that.
Yeah, which is wild.
I can't throw the ball that hard.
Me either. I could probably hit like 20, maybe. I don't even know if I could hit that. I have no measurement to go off of, so...
I feel like one time you and I went to like the Cleveland Science Center and they had a pitch speed thing. And
that
we
probably
just embarrassed
happened.
ourselves.
Well, I mean, next to you, I probably embarrassed myself because I'm sure you can pitch better than I can, but
not anymore. All right. Well, that's been our episode on Moses Fleetwood Walker, the first African American to play Major League Baseball.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service and follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can support the show by visiting anchor.fm/historiesbside.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
and Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.